Okay, so today I will talk about the camera. It's actually possible to vote and work on the same day, as you can see. So, it would be nice if everyone did that. Anyway, today what we are going to do is the following. We are going to write the Schwarzschild metric, which until now we have treated just as a metric outside some spherical star. And today we are going to take it more seriously as a metric over a big range of distances. And basically we are going to ask ourselves the question, so previously R was greater than R tilde, where R tilde is the matter radius, and R tilde for normal objects like stars and planets is many orders of magnitude bigger than GM. Now we ask R specifically equals to GM because it's the point that we are all scared of when we look at this metric, and eventually we can ask whether it makes sense for R to be less than 2GM. Certainly if R is greater than 2GM, even 2.5 GM or anything a little greater than 2GM, then everything we've said previously still holds. Okay, it's only at 2GM that anything can possibly go wrong, and the question is, what goes wrong, or does anything go wrong? Now, clearly something does go wrong because we don't understand what would be a space-time in which, when there's a time interval dt, the amount of invariant distance is 0. Right? If R is 2GM, this thing is 0. So there's no dt squared in the metric. So there's a space-time in which time, moving in time, doesn't contribute to ds squared. Okay? And conversely, moving a little infinitesimal distance in R, at that point R equals 2GM, seems to contribute infinitely to ds squared. So both are problems. Clearly something does. The coefficient of dt squared goes to 0, and coefficient of dr squared goes to infinity. The only thing we can be happy about is that this part doesn't do anything, but in fact that means that this part is of really very little interest, though physically it's important because it's there. It contributes to the fact that the whole thing solves the Einstein equations in 4 dimensions. Okay? Without that, of course, it would be only a 2-dimensional space-time, but doesn't do anything for this problem. And so, as you will see, we will be ignoring it for most of this lecture. Okay, so this happens, and the first question we want to ask. Okay, now some of you, or maybe all of you, have gone through textbooks on this subject, and a lot of textbooks approach this by saying, well, we'll find a clever change of coordinates and then everything will become okay. And you are left dazzled by the brilliance of that textbook's author who has found that clever change of coordinates. So I like to approach things a little bit more in the way that somebody might have done when they were first faced with this problem, or you might do if you are faced with such a problem, which is to start small, do a sample problem with a similar difficulty, with a similar phenomenon, try to solve that, try to understand why we are able to solve it, and then apply the technique here. So that's what I'm going to do. As a result of that, the analysis today will take up the whole lecture just doing equations and coordinates. So you should not mistake this for a physical analysis of what's actually happening in this problem that I'll do in the next lecture. So I'm stretching this out a little longer than people might do because I want to decouple two things. One is how we work with the algebra and the other is how we picturize the geometry and the physics. Okay. So, toy example, we've already seen this example. ds squared is minus x squared dt squared plus x squared. It's called Rindler spacetime. And it exhibits the same phenomenon, at least as this one, that when x goes to 0, this thing disappears, and therefore what's going on? Actually, it's an amusing fact. You can make it exhibit both these phenomena by a simple change of coordinates. So if you write, I think, I don't have this in my notes, but I think if you write y equals x squared, that's right. So y equals x squared, then dx is x squared by x squared, and dx is y dy upon 2x, which is dy upon 2 root y. This is just a amusing aside. If I do this, then the metric is ds squared equals minus y dt squared plus dy squared upon y. Maybe a factor somewhere, or y, factor doesn't matter. But you see, by a simple change of coordinates in Rindler space-time, I've made it have both these problems, that at y equals 0, both this thing goes to 0 and this thing diverges, exactly as happens for the Schwarzschild metric. There's a point at which this goes to 0 and that diverges. It's not important because just this going to 0 by itself is bad enough. But I'm just saying that actually you can see that it can even be brought into a form which makes it more and more analogous to the Schwarzschild case. Okay. So I hope I've convinced you that Rindler spacetime is a good place to start. Now, many lectures ago, I believe it was the 5th lecture, I presented this magically derived change of coordinates. Like my notation today might be different from that time, but we take the t of Rindler and replace it by tan hyperbolic inverse of some new coordinates t prime over x prime, and we take the x and replace it by square root of x prime squared minus t prime squared, and lo and behold, after plugging this in, we find that ds squared is minus dt prime squared plus dx prime squared. Okay, and this was the miraculous change of coordinates which showed us that Rindler is equivalent to Minkowski space, but actually it's not exactly equivalent, because in Rindler space there is a specific range of coordinates. X has to go from 0 to infinity, t goes from minus to plus infinity. When you translate that into this, you find that you've covered only some part of the Minkowski space-time. Once you realize that what these coordinates were doing was covering a part of Minkowski space-time, and now we are free to extend our new coordinates, for which purpose the old coordinates are inadequate. We can extend the new coordinates to cover all of Minkowski space-time, and then we can be happy. I'm saying this briefly now because I'm going to go over this again. But I'm going to not pull this coordinate transformation out of a hat. I'm going to derive it by some physical or geometrical ideology. So the ideology to find such coordinate changes, to find appropriate coordinates, when there appears to be a singularity, inspiration, the inspiring idea is consider null geodesics. So the idea is that null geodesics always help you to understand the geometric structure of the space. One reason will become clear when we do it. Another reason, well, a more general reason is that null lines tell you what the light cone of the space-time is, because light cone is exactly what's bounded by null lines. And light cones have something intimately to do with causality. So light cones tell you something about the causal structure of the space. And with these, you are typically able to pin down what is going wrong at that point and try to fix it by finding new coordinates. Now something even better happens when the space-time is two-dimensional, which is the case for Rindler. And luckily, Schwarzschild is also two-dimensional if we just ignore that last term, and the same procedure will sort of work. Okay, few things work extra in real two dimensions, but for Schwarzschild, most of it will go through also. So in 2D, geodesics are incoming or outgoing. Remember, is just 1D, just one dimension of space. The other dimension is time. Okay. In space, you have a point that you are worried about, and you are traveling on a geodesic. Well, either you are traveling as time evolves, either you are going towards that point, or you are going away from that point. There is no third choice. Okay. And one can argue. I think it's easier for you to argue this yourself, that in this case, null geodesics typically do not intersect. Let's say you consider a family of incoming geodesics. Okay, they'll all be in certain sense parallel. I mean, they're transported sideways, if you like, in space-time. Okay, so they're not. You wouldn't expect them to intersect over finite regions, and one can then use the affine parameter. So I'm sketching the ideology, and then I'll actually do it as a coordinate. So we are in two dimensions. So we take the affine parameter for an incoming geodesic as one coordinate, and the affine parameter for the outgoing geodesic as another coordinate. Now, as we move along our new coordinate, we are actually traversing the geodesic. Okay, and then we are going to be in some naturally adapted system, which when it reaches the singularity will be able to tell us immediately whether that singularity is a bad thing or a good thing. And in Rindler space, what is going to happen is that this procedure will lead to the change of coordinates I've written up here. So I'll show you that. In Schwarzschild, it will similarly lead to a change of coordinates, which we'll do, which are the Kruskal coordinates. But of course, there could be some awful space where you can carry out this procedure, and you will find that when you go into the singularity and these new adapted coordinates based on this affine parameter, you still reach a singularity. After all, if there's really a singularity, you can't possibly get rid of it by changing coordinates. So this is a method which helps you to choose the most natural coordinates, which will actually tell you honestly what's happening at that singular point, at that apparently singular point. I would refer you to the book of Wald, which has an excellent treatment, better than I think all the other books, of this particular issue, and you can read his reasoning, which is actually what I'll be giving you now. Okay. Now before that, when should we, so we will do this now, when should we, so how should we diagnose, given the original metric, whether we expect the singularity to be a kind which goes away by change of coordinates or survives in all coordinate systems? Okay. So diagnostic. So this is a separate topic. So let this statement is over. Diagnostic for a singularity. Well, the only honest diagnostic can be to compute some scalar quantities, because scalar quantities are invariant under change of coordinates. The scalars we know, the obvious scalar we know is just R, which is the Ricci scalar, but it's not the only one. You can make scalars, just that they are not necessarily linear in the curvature. You can't make scalars out of the metric, because if you take the metric and trace it, for example, you get 4 number of dimensions. If you take its depth, you don't get a scalar but a density, also not coordinate independent. If you take the affine connections, they are not tensors anyway, so you can't make scalars out of them. So the first time you find the chance to make scalars is out of Riemann curvature tensors, and this is one such scalar. But here's another one: R mu lambda rho multiplied by R upper mu lambda rho. All this is contact, perfectly good scalar. Here's another one. There are more. You could think of 3 powers of R or 4 powers of R and then contract the indices across all of them. As long as all indices are contracted, it's a scalar. So there are infinitely many. Okay, so these are examples. Now supposing we compute one of these and we find something, how will we interpret the result? If any of these diverges, actually goes to infinity at a point, then there must be a genuine singularity. There is no way out of that fact. Would you agree with that? It diverges at a point in some coordinate system, therefore it diverges at that point in all coordinate systems. Therefore, there is no point hoping that you will find some magical transformation like this to make it flat or smooth or any other thing, because it's going to diverge whatever new coordinate system you find. So it's a good diagnostic. However, what if they don't diverge? What can you say for sure? There are infinitely many, and in fact there are examples where in fact at least this set of them don't seem to diverge, but something or other is wrong with the space at that point. So we'll come to that. We have to talk about geodesic completeness and so on, but that I'm almost postponing for later. So don't assume the diagnostic is the other way. But of course, if these are non-singular, you can always hope that the space-time is non-singular. That you're free to do. What would happen if you computed these things for this case? Now this is a two-dimensional case, so as you know.
Sufficient.
Sorry?
This condition is not sufficient.
Sufficient for what?
So if you find a non-singular R,
yeah.
So does that guarantee that you?
That's what I just said. It doesn't guarantee anything. But if you find a singular one, then it guarantees that the space-time is singular. Okay. Now, what will if you find a non-singular one, then it allows you to hope that there might be a coordinate transformation. Okay. It's not perhaps a wise thing to, once you have calculated these and found them all non-singular, let's say, there's no point saying, well, there are infinitely many more, so let me go on calculating them week after week till something happens. Instead of that, you should then address yourself to the space-time and say, look, can I make some physical sense out of this space-time? And this is where this idea comes in, that try to find new coordinates. You may fail, but you'll never find out till you actually try. And if you succeed in finding coordinates where it's smooth, then you're done. You don't need to compute infinitely many things. So approach, as always, is balanced. Try everything, okay, but in some reasonable order. Now, a logical thing to do with Rindler in the Tx coordinates would be to compute R. It's the only thing anyway, because we are in two space-time dimensions. Okay, so you can compute R. The affine connections in the Rindler, original Rindler system, Rindler coordinate system, affine connections are generically non-zero. There are a couple of them that are non-zero. So you can actually compute R using that. What will you find? Of course, if you do it, I claim you will find 0. Post facto, we know that because you could as well compute it in the new coordinate system. This shows you right away that it's 0. Therefore, it must have been 0 in the old coordinate system. But if you didn't know this coordinate change, you would have to compute it in the old coordinate system and you would find 0. So at least then you would be free to start on your journey of looking for smooth coordinates. By the way, it doesn't have to be 0, it just has to be smooth. In this case, happens to be 0. And in this case, probably there are also not infinitely many curvature invariants because all of them are just powers of R. So actually, in this particular case, in 2 dimensions, if R is smooth, I think you're pretty much done. Okay. In 3 and higher dimensions, there are infinitely many. Okay, good. So from now on, we don't know this transformation, and we are going to try and understand this space by looking for coordinates. Maybe we change coordinates successively until we find the coordinates that we want. Step by step, yes.
Not only are asked full Riemann tensor to be 0.
It's in 2 dimensions, so R itself is the full Riemann tensor, there's nothing else. The Riemann tensor is proportional to this thing times G, as you might have seen in the homework assignment. Proportional to this, so if this is 0, then the full Riemann tensor. That was my point. So this is the only thing there is to calculate, everything else is dictated. Okay. Good. Okay, so let me try to implement this ideology of studying null geodesics. So of course a null geodesic in particular is given by the equation thing equals 0. Now sometime in a couple of lectures back I talked about this kind of condition being either 0 or -1 depending on particle being massless or massive, and said that this is compatible with the geodesic equation. Okay, but in general it doesn't imply the geodesic equation. However, in 2 dimensions for a static metric it does. Okay, so in 2 dimensions in a static metric, any null line is a geodesic. Let's prove that. Before giving you a proof, let me remind you of one thing. We saw long ago, not long ago, 2-3 lectures ago, that in the Schwarzschild metric, if we are trying to study the trajectory of a light ray, we can find the entire radial, we can solve for the radial behavior just from the analog of this equation without looking at the geodesic equation, which is second order. Okay? So what we'll see is that this equation, along with conservation of energy, which is guaranteed because it's a static metric, gives us 2 conditions which are powerful enough to solve completely the trajectory, so there cannot be any more information in the geodesic equation. Okay, but let's do this precisely. So first, let's so because of any static metric, static metric. Okay, now static metric in 2 dimensions. This is only in 2 dimensions. What I just said that this implies the geodesic equation. This is in 2 dimensions. There are no angular directions. Okay. Now in 2 dimensions, the static metric is also diagonal because static means there is no dt dx term. So the only terms are dx squared and dt squared. So it's diagonal. So this equation is gtt times t dot squared plus gxx times x dot squared is 0. Okay. Also because it's static, we have a conserved energy which is defined through the Killing vector d by dt. So it's minus gpt t dot. We've used this before. Okay. Now this equation and the fact that energy is conserved means that d e by d tau is the affine parameter, this is 0, conservation. So this is equal to minus of gtt comma tau t dot plus gtt t double dot. What is gtt comma tau? Gtt depends on t and x depend on the affine parameter tau. So this thing is gtt comma t t dot plus gtt comma x x dot. Same rule. What is gtt comma t for a static metric? Is 0. So we can rearrange this equation as t double dot plus the inverse of gtt will come here. X dot t dot equals 0, and it takes essentially no work to realize that this is twice of gamma t x. So it's the geodesic equation for t. In other words, the geodesic equation for t is a consequence of the energy being conserved. So I should have actually explained this earlier. Moreover, although I am been saying two-dimensional, this part is actually true in general. Okay, because you can see what went into this equation. Imagine that there were many x directions. Then it would be gtt comma I, where I runs over all the space directions, and then xi dot t dot. Okay, as long as the x dot and t dot terms are 0, which are guaranteed by being metric being static, this will always be true. Okay. Where the two-dimensional nature comes in is that the null condition itself, if I differentiate it in the affine parameter tau, gives me g mu nu x dot mu d tau of x dot mu equals 0, and this quantity is the geodesic equation. So it is x double dot mu plus gamma x dot x dot. This is the thing which is the geodesic equation. What we want to argue is that this is 0 for each nu, which we can't argue from this because g mu nu and x dot mu are contracted into it. But now if we use the 2D nature for the first time, then this says gtt t dot d tau of t dot plus gxx x dot d tau of x dot is 0. But this one we've already seen that it's 0, it's this equation. Okay, so now you see that in two dimensions the other term has to be 0. This is non-zero, this is non-zero, so this must be 0. So the trick is energy conservation always gives you the, in a static metric, always gives you the time component of the geodesic equation. That leaves all the space components and one first integral, which is this null condition. So of course if it's only two dimensions, then this is enough to solve everything. And we know this already because if you recall the Schwarzschild orbits, the angular dependence and so on could not be solved from this equation. That had to be separately solved. Okay, but here there is no angular dependence. So is that clear? This part is more general and that part is special to two dimensions. So that was a little digression. Okay, now let's implement this in Rindler spacetime. So can I erase what's on the board now? So now I'll write down this equation for Rindler. It just says minus x squared t dot squared plus x dot squared is 0. Okay. So now I'm not really interested in the behavior of t and x as functions of an affine parameter tau, which is more of arbitrary. What I want to know is dx by dt, but I can eliminate tau from this equation, take this to the other side, and I find dx by dt squared is equal to 1 by x squared. Or is equal to x. Some books do dt by dx with x squared. Okay. So this in turn tells me that t is equal to plus or minus log x plus constant. So from the little digression we took, this is a geodesic in Rindler. Okay, we only solved the null condition, but it has to be a geodesic. And now you can see what I meant about incoming and outgoing. One of these, x will increase as t increases, that's the plus sign. Okay, so that's outgoing, that's going away from the center of this space-time. And when it's minus, then x will come in as t increases, so that's the incoming geodesic. We can also plot it. The inverse of this is x equals constant times e to the plus or minus t. So you can just plot it. Maybe it's t, sorry, it's not that. It's plus or minus t plus. Yeah, that's the same. Okay. So here are the x and t coordinates of Rindler spacetime, and the t equals log x plus constant are like this. These lines have a direction given by the direction of increasing time. As time progresses, I'm going away from the origin. This is the scary place. Okay. On the other hand, the other geodesics are just the time reverse of these. So these are t equals minus log x plus constant. And the arrow in the sense of increasing time is here. And you see that these tend towards the singular place, x equals 0. And what we'll do is we'll try to now change to the affine parameter along these geodesics and these geodesics as our new coordinates. Okay, and in those new coordinates, what we'll be doing is we'll sit on, let's say, this geodesic and keep increasing the coordinate, and we'll end up closer and closer to the singularity, and we'll find out exactly what's going on there. Okay, so choose these. First thing is, let's define the coordinates along these, and then let's scale the coordinates to be the affine parameter. It's 2 steps. Okay. Choosing the coordinates to be along this, choose new coordinates to be along these geodesics. That means that one of the new, let's say the new coordinates are called u and v, then one of them should be parameterized by u equals constant. Which constant will tell me which of these ones I'm taking, and the other family will be parameterized by v equals constant. This is achieved, if you look at this, by just saying that u is t minus log x and v is t plus log x. Okay. So if I have the plus sign here, which is the outgoing geodesic, then on that u is constant, and on the incoming geodesic v is constant.
You take the plus sign, then u is constant.
Sorry. If I take the plus sign, then u is constant, that's correct. And that's the outgoing geodesic. Okay. Good. And of course, these are very easily inverted. So x is e to the v minus u by 2, and t is v plus u. Okay. So we've chosen some new coordinates. So what's the metric in these new coordinates? Can't be very difficult to do because the metric is staring at us there. Actually, all we need is to replace t and x and that x squared using that substitution, and we find that in u and v coordinates, ds squared is e to the minus e to the v minus u du dv. So the first thing that's obvious is that these are null coordinates. Null coordinates are those such that du squared and dv squared should not appear in the metric. Only du. Metric is purely off diagonal. But of course, it's nothing very surprising. In ordinary Minkowski space, the light cone coordinates t plus x and t minus x are exactly u and v. Except that in Rindler, it's not t plus x and t minus x, but t minus plus and minus log x because of the structure of the geodesics, which in turn are due to the structure of that metric with that factor in front. Okay, good. Now, we need to find the affine parameter tau along the u, the constant u and constant v lines. For that, we use the energy integral. Energy is equal to, we already saw, minus gT t dot. This is minus x squared t dot. This is the conserved energy. Okay, so it follows. So this is minus x squared dt by d tau. So we can solve this equation for tau as minus 1 by e integral x squared dt plus constant. Constant will not be of any interest to us. We are just trying to find something proportional to the affine parameter. So a shift or a scaling that we can always make later at our convenience. Okay. Now how do we carry out integral x squared dt? The question is, along what are we integrating this? X and t are both functions of tau, and we'll be able to integrate this when we know along what. But now we have just said it. Along, we want to integrate it along either u is constant or v is constant. Then the integral will be obvious. So first we express this in terms of u and v. So from there, it is e to the v minus u du plus dv by 2. I don't think there were minus, I think I've messed up some minus. Sorry, minus ddt is plus x. This. Okay? So now we make the decision whether we are at u constant or v constant. So let's say u equals constant, then tau is 1 by t integral. So u is constant, so I can bring u outside, e to the minus u outside the integral. Yeah. And e, and it's just, and there's a 2, and it's integral e to the v by 2 perhaps, no, v dv. So it's just e to the v. Okay. In fact, all I wanted was this dependence. The v dependence when u is constant. The rest of it is a constant. Which constant I can vary as per my choice. I can change the constant value of u, and I'll be on some different parallel geodesic. But e to the v is the affine parameter along the u equals constant geodesic up to scale. Okay. Therefore, e to the v is the affine parameter tau along u equals constant. If on the other hand v is constant, I simply do this integral by doing e to the minus u du, and I find that minus e to the minus u is the affine parameter. I don't think anything will go wrong if I didn't put that minus, but you naturally get it by doing the integral along v equals constant. Okay? Good. And now, as promised, we are going to transform to coordinates where these things are the new coordinates. So define u equals minus e to the minus u and v equals e to the v. So we've taken a couple of steps. The first step was to identify the null geodesics and choose coordinates which lie along them. In the second step, we didn't mix the u and v coordinates. We simply took a nonlinear function of u itself to be capital U. That function is the one which is the correct affine parameter along the v equals constant geodesic and vice versa. Okay. Anyway, once you are given the coordinate transformation, it's no big deal to find the metric, and the metric is minus du dv. Get this. A little worried about my minuses. Maybe it's just du dv. It actually makes absolutely no, the metric du dv and minus du dv are exactly the same metric. So maybe we'll choose this way. Good. Now the last step would be to define u and v. We are pretty much done, but we'll analyze it for a few seconds more. But the last step would be then to say u is some t minus x and v is t plus x, and so we get Minkowski space. Now if you trace through all that I have done to go from small x small t to capital X capital T, you will find it's exactly the miraculous change of coordinates which I had written down for you many lectures back, in which we used tan hyperbolic inverse and all that. All that just comes by combining these two transformations. One is u, now that's gone from the board, u and v were t plus and minus log x, and the other was to exponentiate them so that they are the affine parameters. Now let's ask a little bit about the range of coordinates, because that's sort of the whole point. So let's recall that x was between 0 and infinity and t was from minus infinity to plus infinity in this metric. Okay. Now we transformed it using this t plus and minus log x. So I'll have to write it again, unfortunately. Sorry about that. T minus log x and v is t plus log x. I hope this is what I wrote earlier. Okay. So what can we say now? Okay, actually we don't really care much about the range of small u and small v. We care about capital U and capital V. So capital U is equal to e to the minus small u is equal to e to the minus t e to the log x. So it's x e to the minus t. Yes? And v is e to the small v is e to the t e to the log x, and it's x e to the t. Good. And unfortunately, I have got my signs going because u should have been less, should have been minus. I think let me take it minus. I have it happier with minus. So it's this. Actually, I still think it doesn't matter. Okay, now let me keep it as I did. I think what I did was
Actually, minus will be there.
It will be minus.
why?
Because if you take du, take this definition and find the differential.
No, this is okay.
Then it makes sense.
Okay. Sorry.
If you define
There is a plus, and then this is also plus.
Yes.
Exactly. This is correct. All right, but now we learn that x greater than 0 implies that u and v, the capital ones, are both greater than 0. The x was greater than 0 and x appears in front here, so these are also positive. Okay, and this is the statement that Yeah, and now if we translate this into x and t, then we find what we already have discussed many lectures back, that the region is this. Okay, because what you should think is this is in x and t coordinates. So here capital X, capital T. So therefore one of these is, so u is x minus t. So u axis is the one where, okay, so let's say u is constant, then x equals t. So this is u equals constant. So it's the v axis, and this is v equals constant. So it's the u axis. Alright? So therefore, u and v being positive, you just turn yourselves 45 degrees, it's this quadrant. Okay? But from the point of view of x and t coordinates, it's a wedge, as it's called. It's really a rotated quadrant, but it's 1/4 of the whole of Minkowski space-time. And now one can extend manually by hand u and v to cover 2 minus infinity less than u, v less than infinity. Then we cover the whole space, and we find that this, which was the bad point in Rindler space, is now no significant point at all in the whole space. Okay, so this is the process by which we have eliminated the singularity by discovering a change of coordinates, and found also what this geometry of the space is at the end of the game. Now we'll apply this to the Schwarzschild case, and we'll do exactly the same steps. So what I'll be doing is to use this metric without writing r squared d omega 2 square. If you are very fussy, you can just carry it through the entire calculation, otherwise you can add it at the end. But you shouldn't think of this as a solution of two-dimensional gravity. That's a whole different story. Two-dimensional gravity has the most unfortunate property. I'll write it on the side, so because it's not even worth being captured by the video camera. What is this? This is Einstein's equation in 2 dimensions. What is this? What can you say about this quantity in 2 dimensions? It's 0, always. Okay. There's an interesting consequence. I mean, there's an interesting reason. The Einstein action root gr is actually, this whole thing is actually a total derivative. So, in fact, this doesn't even give this as its equation of motion. It doesn't have an equation of motion, just a total derivative. So, gravity, pure gravity is trivial in 2 dimensions. It's not trivial if you add other things. Okay, but in any case, so don't think of this. This will solve that equation, but then anything solves that. That equation is not even an equation. So don't think of it that way. Just think of it as solving the 4-dimensional Einstein equation, and we've dropped the last angular term. What is that angular term that we dropped? It's basically a 2-sphere in theta and phi at every point in this space-time. So if we draw pictures of r and t like Rindler, just in your mind put some sphere of radius r at every point of r and t. Whatever the value of the radius r, put a sphere there. It's exactly like thinking about 3-dimensional space by saying, well, this is r, so wherever here there's a distance r from the origin, we put a sphere of that radius, we pile up all the spheres and we get 3-dimensional space. Exactly the same process. Okay, good. So let's stop talking and get to work. Good. Null geodesic. So g mu x dot mu is 0. So 1 minus 2 gm upon r t dot plus 1 over 1 minus 2 gm upon r dot 0. So dr by dt, the dr by dt, or people prefer dt by dr in this case. So again we can eliminate the proper time, or not proper time, sorry, the affine parameter. This is a null case. So the tau parameter we can eliminate again by this, by suitably taking things to the other side and bringing them. So this should be 1 minus 2 gm by r.
E square now. E square square. E square.
Thank you. And this miraculously remains true, but with a plus or minus. Oh, no, I think I got the place wrong again. Yeah, it's plus or minus 1 over 1 minus 2 gm. That's it. Okay. Good. So we have to integrate this. So integrating gives P equals plus or minus integral dr r upon r minus 2 gm. Good. Plus a constant. And this is easy to write by writing this as 1 plus 2 gm upon r minus 2 gm. Yeah. And this is plus or minus of r plus 2 gm log of this stuff. Okay. Now log, I don't like to write log of something which has dimensions. R minus 2 gm has dimension of length. So I'll write it as log of r by 2 gm minus 1. The difference is log of 2 gm, which will go into the gm times log of gm, whatever goes into the constant. Okay. Very good. Now let's define r star equals r plus 2 gm log. This has a name. It's called the tortoise coordinate. Let's try to understand briefly why it has that name and then go on. The key point is that for regular steps in R star or in the region. Okay, first off, so before that, first let's notice so properties of R star. One, R star goes to infinity, R goes to infinity. But it's a monotonic function. If this R is very large, this right side is R plus log R, so it goes linearly with a small extra correction of log R. So both of them go to plus infinity together. Okay. Next, supposing R is exactly equal to 4 gm. Then what is R star equal to? 4 gm. Because the second term vanishes. So they become equal at this particular point. Okay. Now let's ask what happens at R equals. The next step probably would be R star equals 0. R star can go negative because log can go negative. This side cannot, this one cannot, but log can certainly go negative. and in fact log can go arbitrarily negative and win over this. So this cannot be negative, but it can be very small, and then log can be negative and win, so R star can be negative. So let's ask if R star can be 0. Of course it is when R plus 2gm log.
So if you reduce R below 2gm, then the
Yeah.
log of that quantity is a negative.
Yes, so exactly. So we're not going to do that. So R star we're going to assume is real, which means that this whole thing works only for the region R greater than 2g. So the goal here is think of R equals to gm as in Rindler space x equals 0. It's the end. Okay, because below 2gm we really don't know what to do until we pass through 2gm. So let's first try to go all the way to 2gm. Another way of stating it is the Schwarzschild solution in R and T only describes space-time outside R equals 2gm at best. That also I call the matrix inside. So we'll make sure that it describes it not only outside but up to and including the boundary, the horizon, the surface of this thing at 2gm. Okay. Once we understand that in some new coordinates, we'll next try to see if that place is non-singular. After that, if it is non-singular, we can try to extend the coordinates, and by extending the new coordinates, we'll be able to go inside what used to be R equals to gm in a control. That's the stuff. Okay. So this is a particular some value of R such that this is 0. You can solve it, but it's not very illuminating. And finally, R star then thereafter is negative, and it reaches minus infinity exactly when R reaches 2gm, because then this reaches minus infinity, and this is some finite thing. So this. So these are some properties of R star. The second thing about it is that near R star equals minus infinity or R equals 2gm. Near means just about those values. Regular steps in R star translate into smaller and smaller steps in R, which is the reason for the name of tortoise coordinates. Because as R star, let's say it's minus a million and 1 million and 2 million and 3 million and 4. It's going in steps of 1, 1, 1. This thing is going towards 2gm in ever decreasing steps, so that finally when this really reaches minus infinity, which it never does since minus infinity is not a number, this finally reaches 2gm, which it therefore also never does. Okay, it gets slower and slower as it's reaching R equals 2gm. That's the message. Okay. So that's the reason for the name. But anyway, it's perfectly clear this is a definite function. There's nothing mysterious about the function.
So what happens if R equals to 0?
Yeah, If I were you, I wouldn't go there in these coordinates. If I were you, I would wait till I find the coordinates in which we can go there. And even then, I wouldn't go there, but at least we'll talk about it. I just said 5 minutes ago that this describes the region R greater than 2gm. So therefore, it doesn't describe the region R equals 0. Okay, the whole goal of this lecture is to find out how to go to R equals 2gm, without which we can't think of going to R less than 2gm, without which we can't reach R. Good. Now let's try to remember what we did in Rindler. Okay, this thing is we have just solved the null equation to find that T. So solution of null geodesic. So null geodesic or null geodesics are T equals plus or minus R star. Okay, we haven't changed coordinates as such, though we could if we wanted to. In the new coordinates, the null geodesics would be very simple. Of course, the metric would be complicated. Okay, but whatever it is, these are the null geodesics. That's what we just found. So therefore, if we want to define new coordinates small u and small v, such that one of them is constant on the ingoing, again we have the same story. One is ingoing, one is outgoing. Incoming and outgoing. I don't know. Some books say ingoing and outgoing. I suppose it all depends where you are. Anyway, so how do we define u and v in terms of these such that u is constant on one of them and v is constant on the other? Very simple, right?
T minus S minus.
Yeah, exactly. So t minus r star and t plus r. So great. We've derived without any assumptions or guesswork a sensible coordinate change, which puts us properly on null geodesics. Okay, now I fix u and move in v, or fix v and move in u, and I'm on a null geodesic for sure. So that's great. So it's very good to transform coordinates into the uv coordinates, and what we find is the following. First of all, let's notice that r star is equal to v plus u by 2. Okay, but r star is a particular function of r plus log something. So this determines r as a function of u and v. Is that clear? It's that function which you get. In fact, it's a function of u plus v. You get it by solving r plus log of all that stuff is equal to v plus 2 by 2. Whatever solution you get for r, we'll call it r of u and v. It should be v minus u by solution. Thank you. Good. So whatever we get, we'll get r as a function of u and v. Okay. So from now on, r will keep appearing. The problem is that I can't write a simple function for r because it's a solution of a more complicated equation of the form r plus log r equals something. There's no simple function. If there was, we would be writing that function. But whatever it is, the function has the name r of u and v. Okay. So we'll keep writing the metric using r, but now r is not a coordinate, it's the function of u and v. However, r is still the position with respect to our original spherically symmetric object. So it has a dual role. The value of r reminds us where we are in the original object. Okay, r equals 2gm is still the correct place that we are trying to understand. But r, when it appears in the metric, is that function of u and v obtained by solving this equation. Okay, so in terms of this, we easily find that the metric is minus 1 by 2 gm over r du. If you really want, I could write this. Okay, so we are not really done. We haven't gained too much. There's still a problem at r equals 2 gm. Okay, it's just that now the problem occurs at the value of u and v such that r is equal to 2 gm. Okay, good. The next step is to find the, okay, so before we find the affine parameter, it's useful to rewrite this a little bit. Good. So here's a clever transformation. We'll write log. Okay, so let's refer to this equation r equals r of u and v. It is r plus 2gm log r by 2gm minus 1 is v minus u by 2. So we can't solve this explicitly for r, but we can use it to simplify things by solving for log of this in terms of vu and r. So just take r on the other side, and we get log of r by 2gm minus 1 equals what? V minus u by 2 minus r 1 by 2gm. So now let's exponentiate it. That implies that r by 2gm minus 1 is e to the minus r by 2gm e to the v minus u by 4g. And therefore this factor which comes in the metric 1 minus 2gm upon r is obtained by just multiplying this thing by 2gm upon r. So it's 2gm e to the minus r by 2gm upon r e to the v minus u upon over g. Looks like we haven't gained very much. We've expressed this coefficient, which is a function of r, u and v, using the definition of r of u and v, which is this, in terms of these functions of r and these explicitly functions of a and u. No harm done, of course. So let's write the metric now. ds squared is minus 2gm e to the minus r by 2gm over r e to the v minus u over 4gm dv. Probably what I am doing could have been achieved by finding the affine parameter along the geodesic. But what we are trying to do here, if you can see, you might sort of see what the scheme is. What we've done is we've manipulated this into the form that the last part is exactly the Rindler metric up to some 4gm factor. It's exactly that Rindler metric e to the v minus u du dv, okay, which we simplified by choosing capital U is e to the minus small u and capital V is e to the small v. So we'll just choose it. Capital U is e to the minus u, v is the v. This time I dare not screw up my signs. They say of course over 4gm, sorry. And they say minus, so I'm putting a minus. Not liking this. There's some fundamental minus sign haunting me. What did we find? We found du dv. That had a minus, right? Now d of capital U. It's correct. Minus, yeah, this is good. This is good, this is good. Okay. So now, all of this stuff is du dv. Right? So therefore ds squared is equal to minus 2gm. Now, in this expression wherever r appears, it is r of capital U and capital V, which is obtained by taking this and noticing that this is log of capital V and this is log of capital U with some factors appropriately put in. Whatever it is, keep making change of variables, but r is always a function of the final variables. Okay, but this is the next thing. Now it's when we reach such an end point, okay, I think there are some factors, sorry. When I take du and dv capital, I get some powers of 4gm. Okay, so I have to compensate for those, and so this is actually minus 32g cubed. Of course, it's pure numerical factor of no consequence for our analysis, but we should try to get it right. And now we are in a position, we have a metric now, you see, which for no value of capital U and capital V appears to have any weird behavior, as long as we control capital U and V, so that small r is still greater than or equal to 2gm. Okay, but at small r equals 2gm, this will be 2gm, this will be 2gm, and U and V will take some values, and you can see there is nothing strange about those values. Okay, and that's where we'll be, but there's absolutely no sign of any singularity in the metric. So this is how our methodology has paid us off, but we are not done. Let's press on. So first of all, we can now go back to x and t type coordinates. now restore r square d omega 2 square, which we've been dropping all along. The understanding again is that any r which appears in this formula is a function of dnx. Now any further analysis of this metric, we'll have to again remind ourselves what function of dnx it is, because we made 3 changes of variables. First, well, 4 perhaps. First from r we went to r star, then to small v and u, then to capital V and u, then to capital dnx. But shouldn't be too hard. Trace the whole thing back and write down what is the change of variables from the beginning to the end. So let me write it. R equals r of t and x is defined by, actually what happens is take this equation and exponentiate it. We'll first divide both sides by 2gm and then exponentiate it. Okay? So it's e to the r by 2gm is the first term. The second term we divide it and we exponentiate it, so we just get the factor r by 2gm minus 1. On the right side, we get e to the v by 4gm, that's capital V, and we get e to the minus u by 4gm, that's minus u. So finally, minus u v, and I've done something wrong as usual. Why have I done this thing wrong? No, it's right, it's minus uv. Yeah, it's minus u. Correct. And this is, in x and t coordinates, it is, so what was u and v? U was t minus x. V was t plus x. So this is minus t squared plus t. Sorry, it's not it's minus. So it is x squared minus t. Sorry, something wrong? For once I should get the sign right statistically. 50% of the time at least I should get what?
Both these to be accepted.
No. There's a minus here, so this is a okay? Now we okay? Good. Very nice. So this is the definition of R as a function of x and t. Not so bad actually. After so many transformations, it's a pretty simple thing, except it has exponential and power. So whatever it is, that's what you get. Okay. Now R is doing all this, but the original time t must also be writable in terms of new coordinates. And if you remember, t was u plus v by 2. So again, we exponentiate, well, we don't exponentiate, we just notice that this is equal to, so u is minus, is log minus 4gm log of minus capital U plus 4gm log of v upon 2. And this thing is equal to 2gm log of x plus t over x minus t. Okay, you can just check, well, obvious. 2 cancels this, you get 2gm, then log of v upon minus u. So that's x plus t over x minus t. So that, more pleasantly, this can also be written as 4gm tan hyperbolic inverse of t by x. Simple identity between this thing and that thing. It can be proved by taking the tan hyperbolic to the other side and using the definition. Okay. So in particular, I hope the analogy with Ringler space is pretty clear. Okay, this is very close to the transformation that we used to get to Ringler space. Get Ringler space to look like plugging. And now we have to talk about the allowed ranges of coordinates. And before that, let me give you the names. So x and T are called Kruskal coordinates. But there is also a second person, Keres, whose name is, yes, coordinates. Along the way, some of the coordinates we defined were called Eddington-Finkelstein coordinates, but I didn't dwell on them. They have their own usefulness. We'll worry about them whenever they come up. But anyway, this. And now the key thing is to understand the geometry of these coordinates, in particular the range of these coordinates. What range do they take? So first, let's ask what range they take when r is greater than 2 gm. Okay. So is that visible from the definition? Let's first point out that the only constraint on the original things was r greater than 2 gm. Later we want to relax the constraint and say r greater than 0. We cannot ever relax the constraint below r equals 0. There was a spherically symmetric body. Okay, it had some strange behavior at r equals 2 gm, but it had its origin at r equals 0, around which it was symmetric, and we certainly cannot think of going below that value of r. So r greater than 0 is an absolute bound, but we'll keep r greater than 2 gm. And for this, sorry?
I mean, the metrical problem definitely equal to 0.
Yeah, we'll come to it. Just give me some time, please. Right now we are at r greater than 2 gm. Okay, and the question is what bound on these coordinates is satisfied. Now from this equation, this one, you see that r greater than 2 gm is exactly the place where this thing turns positive. And r equals 2 gm is where this thing is 0, and therefore this thing is 0. And what is this thing being 0? It's the light cone of the Kruskal coordinates. Okay. So therefore we learn that if this is x and this is t, then this region is r greater than 2 gm. So we learn that the exterior of this object, which from now on I might as well call a black hole, so I haven't proved to you that it's a black hole. The exterior of this object is a wedge of Kruskal coordinates, exactly in the way that Rindler spacetime is a wedge of Minkowski coordinates. Okay, and the region r equals 2 gm, but I have drawn this angle a bit badly. The region r equals 2 gm is this line as well as this line, and these are the lines when t is equal to x or t is equal to minus x, and the metric, which by now has probably disappeared from the board, has nothing visible wrong with it at those points. After all, the metric was what? It was ds squared equals e to the minus r by 2 gm on r, some numerical factor which I am going to ignore now, and minus dt squared plus dx squared. So at x equals t, of course there is nothing wrong with dx squared or dt squared, and what happens to that coefficient? It goes to the simple value 1 by 2 gm, because r is 2 gm, so this goes to, 1 by whatever, e 2 gm is a perfectly good number, nothing wrong with it. So completely non-singular. Okay. Now the last thing before I stop is to say, okay, now it suggests that just as Rindler space was understood as a part of Minkowski space, and we would then, once we understood that, we would just cover all of Minkowski space and say, well, that's the extended space, the extension of Rindler space. Here, we can try to do the same thing, allow x and t to range over more general values than just this quadrant, and say that this is the extended space-time of the object we were studying, the Schwarzschild solution, okay, but which was not visible or understandable in the old coordinates, but it's understandable in the new ones, and moreover it may be non-singular. However, we run into a different problem, which is that, okay, this much is r greater than 2 gm, but r certainly should be greater than 0. Okay, I'm not distinguishing between greater than 0 and greater than or equal to 0. I'm trying to find out what's the boundary of the region r equals 0, because that is not negotiable. We can't extend x and t beyond that. Otherwise, our physical interpretation that there was a spherically symmetric body in the first place is gone. Okay. Now, what's r equals 0? This equation will tell us, hopefully. At r equals 0, this term drops out. This becomes 1. So, this whole thing becomes minus 1. So, we find x squared minus t squared equals minus 1. What kind of curve is that? Hyperbola. Very good. So, can somebody show me with their hands where this hyperbola should sit? Very good. So, hyperbola has 2 branches. So, this is one and that's the other. Okay, so this is r equals 0 and so is this. Okay, so in Kruskal coordinates r equals 0 is the full hyperbola with 2 branches, and this is the region that's totally excluded. So this isn't in the picture at all. We're never supposed to talk about it. Anybody who tries to talk about it has to be shot dead immediately. It's not allowed. Okay? Good. So I don't want to shade it because here I shaded the allowed region. Anyway, so well, let's do this for barbed wire. Now this region is okay. Okay? So the maximal Kruskal extension of Schwarzschild space-time is to say that t and x take all values in this quadrant as well as the image quadrant there, as well as above and below, but here and here. This is the region. So actually it's everything in the full 2-dimensional plane that's between the 2 branches of this hyperbola. That's the maximum possible. It's still another question whether this is physically realizable, because after all, we still have in mind that this could be an object with some matter which is there down to some radius below which we shouldn't have been solving Einstein equation in free space at all. So if there is some such thing, then this could also be cut off. Okay, so this is called the maximal Kruskal extension. And what we've achieved is that without making too many assumptions, but just following the logic of going along geodesics, non-geodesics, we found a nice coordinatization of the Schwarzschild metric, and it makes it very manifest that there is no singularity in the metric at r equals 2 gm. Okay, there is still a singularity in the metric at r equals 0. That's visible from here. Okay. Now the question is, before embarking on this enterprise, perhaps we should have computed some curvature invariants, but that's a bit of a pain. Moreover, I think most computations of curvature invariants use orthonormal frames, which I haven't yet taught you. But seeing this answer, you can already guess what we are going to find if we computed curvature invariants. A, we wouldn't find any singularity in r squared or r mu nu lambda rho squared or anything like that at r equals 2 gm. By the way, we can't guarantee what we would in any coordinate system. We can't guarantee what we would find if we computed r mu nu lambda rho, because this is coordinate dependent. This might have a singularity at r equals 2 gm, but this can't have. So this better be non-singular. Similarly, just the humble Ricci scalar is already non-trivial for this solution. That also better be non-singular if we calculate it without any of these change of coordinates. But both of them, we expect, have a perfectly good chance to be singular at r equals 0. And in fact, one will find r equals 0 is a point of infinitely large curvature. Okay. So therefore, there is a problem at r equals 0. One can still talk about it and one can ask what to do about it. But for now, this is what I want to say. Now, with all of this, there's still a lot to be discussed, because now we should ask questions about what will happen if a particle travels in the space-time. Up to now, we've only focused on the space-time, but general relativity is a sort of alternating sequence of first understanding the space-time, then putting a particle in it, massless or massive, letting it propagate, see where it goes, see how it travels, and then maybe go to another space-time. So the second half of this analysis is completed. Okay, are there any questions?
The region on the left also arbitrary.
The region on the left here is also R greater than M. I guess you're right. Yeah. Yeah. No. Wait. Actually, I think I even said something not exactly right. Thanks for pointing that out.
Isn't it that idea you gave earlier that doing of two spaces at the
It is. I think it's related to that. That in Riddler space also you could have said that you get whether you get two edges or one would be up to you. But I think here there's another way to say that, which is that R greater than 2gm is a single. Okay, so we'll be talking about causality and causally connected regions. And I think the correct interpretation is that R greater than the region outside this thing is really the right side of this. Let me try to clarify that. Thank you. That's a good question. X squared greater than T squared. Did we say anything earlier about X being positive?
In Riddler, the transformation relations told you that it should be positive X.
Positive X, yes.
The domain of definition.
Yes.
So that is why in Riddler we shaded the right. Even though equations X plus T, X minus T, whatever, it should be in both the quadrants.
Mm-hmm.
But we chose this one because the transformation relation X has to be greater than 0.
Let's come back to it next time, because next time I'll be talking about this global diagram and talking about particles moving. We'll clarify all this.